The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty trading post, and Sarah Grace stumbled out with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and bruises hidden beneath the long sleeves, her entire body trembling as she scanned the harsh Texas landscape of Brownsville for any sign that her husband's men had followed her this far south. It was July of 1878, and the heat pressed down on the small border town like a suffocating blanket. Sarah had been traveling for 6 days straight, switching coaches twice and sleeping in barn lofts when she could find them, always moving, always terrified that Calvin would find her before she could disappear completely. The other passengers gave her curious looks as they disembarked, but Sarah kept her eyes down and her bonnet pulled low over her face. She had learned in the 3 years of her marriage that drawing attention only brought pain. The trading post was a weathered building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Beyond it, she could see the main street of Brownsville stretching out in both directions, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to wilt in the oppressive summer heat. Across the street, a saloon's piano music drifted through the swinging doors. Further down, she spotted what looked like a general store, a blacksmith's forge sending up sparks, and a small church with a white steeple that had gone gray with dust. Sarah's stomach twisted with hunger. She had eaten almost nothing in days, spending the last of her hidden money on the final stagecoach ticket. Now she stood in a strange town with no money, no family, and no plan beyond getting as far from St. Louis as possible. "You need help finding somewhere, miss." The stagecoach driver was looking at her with concern, his weathered face kind beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I am meeting someone." It was a lie, but she had become good at lying over the past 3 years. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto the coach, and within minutes, Sarah was alone on the dusty street, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. She forced herself to walk toward the general store, trying to appear purposeful even though panic was rising in her chest. What had she been thinking, running with no real destination? But staying would have meant death. She was certain of it. Calvin's rage had been escalating for months, and the last time he had beaten her, she had seen something in his eyes that told her the next time might be the last. The general store was blessedly cooler inside, though still warm. An older woman behind the counter looked up from her inventory book and studied Sarah with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Can I help you with something?" Sarah's prepared lie died on her lips. She was too tired, too hungry, too desperate. "I am looking for work, any kind of work. I can clean, cook, sew, tend animals. I am a hard worker and I will not cause trouble." The woman's expression softened slightly. Running from something, Sarah hesitated, then nodded. There seemed no point in denying what must be obvious from her appearance. "Husband." Another nod. The woman sighed and came around the counter. Up close, Sarah could see she was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that showed years of hard work. "I am Margaret Hayes. I run this store with my husband Thomas. We do not have work for you here, but I know someone who might." Hope flared in Sarah's chest, painful and bright. Margaret gestured for her to follow and led her out the back door of the store, into a narrow alley that ran between the buildings. They walked in silence for a few minutes, turning onto a side street where the buildings gave way to scattered houses, and then to open land dotted with mesquite trees and patches of dry grass. About half a mile from town, they came to a ranch that was modest but well kept. A wooden fence enclosed several corrals, and Sarah could see horses grazing in a larger pasture beyond. The house itself was single-story, built of wood that had weathered to a soft gray, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. A man was working near one of the corrals, repairing a section of fence. He straightened as they approached, pushing his hat back to reveal a face that made Sarah's breath catch despite her exhaustion and fear. He was perhaps 25 or 26, tall and lean with the build of someone who spent his days doing hard physical work. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, curling at the ends where it touched his collar. But it was his face that held her attention, strong-featured and sun-bronzed, with gray-blue eyes that regarded them with curiosity rather than the suspicion she had expected. "Samuel Caine, this is Sarah," Margaret said, deliberately omitting Sarah's last name. "She just arrived in town and needs work. I thought you could use some help around here." Samuel pulled off his work gloves and tucked them into his belt, his gaze moving from Margaret to Sarah. She forced herself not to look away, though her instinct was to drop her eyes. She had learned that men like Calvin preferred women who kept their gaze down, but something told her that would be the wrong approach here. "What kind of work are you looking for?" His voice was deep and steady, without the edge of anger that had become so familiar to her. "Anything you need." "I can cook and clean, tend gardens, help with animals. I grew up on a farm in Ohio before." She stopped herself. "I am a hard worker, and I will not be trouble." Samuel studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see far more than she wanted to reveal. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a yellowish green, barely visible now, but there were others hidden beneath her clothing that still ached when she moved wrong. "I could use help with the horses," he said finally. "I have been taking on more training work lately, and I am behind on everything else. The house is a mess. I have been eating mostly beans and coffee for weeks, and my vegetable garden is more weeds than vegetables at this point. But I need to be honest with you. I cannot pay much. Room and board and $5 a month to start. If the arrangement works out, we can discuss more later." $5 was almost nothing, but Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. It was safety. It was a place Calvin would never think to look for her, a place where she might have time to catch her breath and figure out what came next. That would be more than fair. "Thank you." Samuel nodded and turned to Margaret. "Thank you for bringing her out here. I have been meaning to get to town for supplies but kept putting it off." "Well, now you have help, so you have no excuse," Margaret said with a small smile. She turned to Sarah and squeezed her arm gently. "You need anything, you come find me in town. Understand?" Sarah nodded, fighting back tears at the unexpected kindness. Margaret headed back toward town, and Sarah was left alone with this stranger who had just agreed to give her sanctuary. "You have any belongings?" Samuel asked. "No, nothing." Something flickered in his eyes, anger perhaps, but not directed at her. "All right, let me show you the house and where you will be staying." He led her up onto the porch and through the front door. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Sarah's eyes a moment to adjust. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace on one wall, a battered sofa and chairs arranged nearby, and a simple kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a table, and open shelves holding mismatched dishes and supplies. "It is not much," Samuel said, and she could hear embarrassment in his voice. "I built most of it myself when I bought the land 3 years ago. There are 2 bedrooms. The larger one is mine. You can have the other one." He showed her down a short hallway to a small bedroom that held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a simple chair. A window looked out over the horse pastures, and the late afternoon light streamed in golden and warm. "I know you probably want to rest," Samuel said from the doorway, "but you look like you have not eaten in a while. I can heat up some beans, and there is bread from a few days ago. It is getting stale but still edible." Sarah turned to face him, this stranger who was showing her more consideration than her own husband ever had. "You do not need to trouble yourself. If you show me where things are, I can prepare something for both of us. That is what you are paying me for after all." A small smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and less guarded. "You do not officially start work until tomorrow. Tonight you are a guest. Come on." He heated the beans on the stove while Sarah sat at the table, her exhaustion suddenly overwhelming now that she had stopped moving. She watched him work, noting the easy competence in his movements, the way he moved around the small kitchen like someone accustomed to taking care of himself. When he set a plate in front of her, the beans were hot and flavored with bacon fat, and the stale bread had been toasted over the stove top to make it more palatable. Sarah ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour the food like the starving creature she felt like. Samuel sat across from her with his own plate, eating in companionable silence. She could feel him glancing at her occasionally, but he did not press her with questions, and she was grateful for that. "There is a pump out back for water," he said when they had finished. "It is cold and clean. I will heat some for you so you can wash up if you like. I have some shirts that might work as a night dress for you until we can get you some proper clothes. You have done more than enough already. It is just water and an old shirt." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "You look exhausted." "I will get that water heating." Samuel proved as good as his word, heating water in a large pot on the stove, and then carrying it to her room along with a basin, soap, and one of his shirts, which he left folded on her bed. He also brought a towel and, to her surprise, a small piece of mirror. "I will be outside tending the horses for a while," he said. "You take your time and get settled." After he left, Sarah locked the bedroom door with shaking hands and then stood in the middle of the small room, hardly daring to believe she was here, that she was safe, at least for tonight. She undressed slowly, wincing at the bruises that still colored her ribs and back in shades of purple and yellow. The warm water felt like heaven as she washed away days of travel, and Samuel's shirt, though much too large, was clean and soft from many washings. She lay down on the narrow bed, meaning to rest for just a few minutes, and fell into the deepest sleep she had known in years. When Sarah woke, dawn light was filtering through the window, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then it came back to her in a rush: Brownsville, the ranch, Samuel Caine and his unexpected kindness. She sat up quickly, alarmed that she had slept so late. The sun was already up, which meant Samuel must have been working for hours. She dressed quickly in her travel-worn dress, finger-combing her dark blonde hair as best she could before braiding it and pinning it up. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room empty, but evidence that Samuel had been up for a while. There were dishes in the wash basin, and the coffee pot was half full, still warm on the stove. Sarah poured herself a cup, and then began exploring the kitchen more thoroughly, taking inventory of what was available. The supplies were basic but adequate: flour, cornmeal, beans, rice, coffee, sugar, salt, lard, and some potatoes and onions in a crate. There was bacon hanging in the small pantry, along with some dried beef and a few cans of tomatoes and peaches. She could work with this. Sarah started a fire in the stove and began preparing a proper breakfast. She found eggs in a basket on the back porch, along with a small crock of butter that had been keeping cool in a bucket of well water. By the time Samuel came in an hour later, she had biscuits baking, bacon frying, and eggs ready to cook. He stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "You did not have to do all this. You are paying me to cook, are you not?" She cracked eggs into the hot pan, relieved to have something to do with her hands. "Besides, you need a decent meal. No one can live on beans and coffee alone." I have been doing a fair job of it for the past month." But there was amusement in his voice, and when she glanced at him, she saw that small smile again. They ate together at the table, and Sarah was pleased to see Samuel take second helpings of everything. He was thin, she realized, not in an unhealthy way but like someone who worked hard and did not eat quite enough to keep up with the demands he placed on his body. "This is the best meal I have had in months," he said, sopping up egg yolk with a biscuit. "Maybe years." "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother. She could make a feast out of almost nothing." Sarah felt a pang of homesickness for the first time in years. Her mother had died when Sarah was 18, and her father had followed 6 months later from a heart that simply gave out from grief. She had been alone and vulnerable, which was how Calvin had been able to convince her that marriage to him was her only option. "Tell me about the work here," she said, changing the subject. "You said you train horses." Samuel nodded, pushing his empty plate away with obvious reluctance. "I buy young horses, mostly Mustangs that have been caught wild, and I train them for saddle or harness work. Some I sell to ranchers, some to the army, some to families who just need a good, reliable horse. I have been getting more business lately, which is good, but it means I am behind on everything else. What do you need me to do today? Honestly, just keeping the house running would be a huge help. But if you know anything about gardens, that patch out back is in desperate need of attention. And if you are comfortable around horses, I could use help with some of the basic care, grooming, checking hooves, that sort of thing. I grew up with horses. I can do all of that." Samuel's face brightened. "That is even better than I hoped. Come on, let me show you around properly." He gave her a tour of the property, pointing out the well, the chicken coop she had not noticed the night before, the vegetable garden that was indeed more weeds than vegetables, and the various corrals and the small barn where he kept feed and tack. There were 8 horses currently on the property, ranging from a gray mare that was fully trained and ready to sell to a young bay gelding that still watched them with wild, suspicious eyes from the far corner of his corral. "That one is going to be a challenge," Samuel said, following her gaze. "I have only had him a week, and he is still scared of everything. But he has good lines and a good temperament under the fear. He will make someone a fine horse once he learns to trust." Sarah understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. The days fell into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. Sarah rose early and made breakfast, then spent her mornings working in the garden or the house while Samuel trained horses. She made lunch, which they ate together on the porch in the shade, and then she would help him with the horses in the afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed. Evenings were for preparing dinner and then sitting on the porch as the sun went down, too tired for much conversation but comfortable in the silence. Samuel was unlike any man Sarah had ever known. He was quiet but not cold, reserved but not unfriendly. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience when she asked questions about the horses or the work, never stood too close or looked at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. When she flinched away from a sudden movement in those first days, he noticed but did not comment, simply became more careful about approaching her. At the end of her first week, he took her into town in his wagon to buy supplies and, despite her protests, bought her 2 dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, a bonnet, and various other necessities. When she tried to tell him she could wait and buy them with her first month's wages, he shook his head. "You need them now, not in 3 weeks. Consider it an advance." Sarah wanted to argue, but the relief of having clean clothes that fit and shoes that did not have holes worn through the soles was too great. She thanked him quietly, and he nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude in a way that made her realize acts of kindness were simply natural to him, not something he expected praise for. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to relax in small increments. She stopped jumping at sudden noises. She began to sleep through the night without nightmares. The constant knot of tension in her shoulders started to ease. And slowly, carefully, she began to notice Samuel not just as her employer, but as a man. It was impossible not to notice, really. The way he handled the horses, firm but infinitely patient. The way he would spend an extra hour working with the fearful bay gelding, talking to him in a low, steady voice until the horse took one step closer, then another. The way Samuel looked in the early morning light when he did not know she was watching, his face unguarded and peaceful as he went about his work. She tried to tell herself it was only gratitude she felt, appreciation for his kindness and the safety he had given her. But she was beginning to suspect it was something more, something that both thrilled and terrified her. It was mid-August when the first letter arrived from St. Louis. Samuel brought it back from town along with the weekly supplies, his face troubled. "This came to the post office addressed to me. The postmaster said a man came through asking if anyone named Sarah had arrived in town recently. He told him no, but I thought you should know someone is looking." Sarah's hands shook as she took the letter, recognizing Calvin's handwriting on the envelope. She did not need to open it to know what it would say. Threats, promises that he would find her, demands that she return. She had known he would search for her, but she had hoped she had covered her tracks well enough that he would not think to look this far south. "You need to rate it," Samuel asked gently. Sarah shook her head and walked to the stove, thrusting the letter into the fire. They both watched it burn. "Is he dangerous?" Samuel's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Yes." "Will he come here?" "I do not know. Maybe. Probably." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the summer heat. "I should leave. I should not have stayed this long. I am putting you in danger. You are not going anywhere." Samuel's tone left no room for argument. "This is your home now, and I do not run from bullies." "You do not understand. Calvin is not just a bully. He was." She struggled to find words that would make him understand. "He is connected. He has money and friends in powerful places. He could make trouble for you, real trouble. Let him try." Samuel reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her beyond an accidental brush of hands, and Sarah felt herself lean into the contact despite her fear. "You are safe here, Sarah. I promise you that." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had learned the hard way that promises meant little when faced with Calvin's determination. Still, she nodded, not trusting her voice. That night, she noticed Samuel checking the locks on the doors and windows before bed, and she saw that he had moved his rifle to a more accessible spot near his bedroom door. The knowledge that he was taking the threat seriously should have frightened her more, but instead, it made her feel protected in a way she never had before. The next few weeks passed without incident, and Sarah began to hope that perhaps Calvin had given up, that the letter had been a last attempt at intimidation before he moved on with his life. It was a foolish hope, and she knew it, but she clung to it anyway because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Life at the ranch continued to unfold in small moments that Sarah treasured. Teaching Samuel how to make a proper pie crust, and laughing at his flour-covered face when his first attempt fell apart. Sitting in the corral with the fearful bay gelding, now named Jack, and feeling her heart swell when he finally approached close enough to lip at her outstretched hand. Long conversations on the porch after dinner, where she learned about Samuel's childhood in Virginia, his family who had died in a fever outbreak when he was 19, his decision to come west and start over. Sharing her own stories, carefully edited to avoid the parts that still hurt too much to speak about. It was during one of these evening conversations in early September that Samuel said something that changed everything. "I am glad Margaret brought you here that day." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the admission. "I am glad, too. This place, it has given me peace. You have given me peace." Samuel met her eyes, and in the fading light she could see something in his expression that made her breath catch. "It has not been just peace for me." The air between them seemed to shift, becoming charged with possibility. Sarah knew she should look away, should retreat to the safety of polite employer and employee distance, but she found she could not move. "Sarah, I know you have been hurt. I do not know the details, and you do not need to tell me unless you want to. But I need you to know that I have come to care for you. More than I should, probably, given that you work for me. If that makes you uncomfortable, I will never mention it again, and things can go on as they have been. But I wanted you to know." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She thought of Calvin, of his cruelty disguised as love, of the way he had isolated her and controlled her and hurt her. She thought of the fear she had lived with for 3 years, the certainty that she would never be free of him. And then she thought of Samuel, his patience and kindness, the way he had given her safety and asked for nothing in return. The way he looked at her like she was something precious rather than something to be possessed. "It does not make me uncomfortable," she said quietly. "It terrifies me, but not because of you, because I care for you too, and I am afraid of what that means. I am afraid I do not know how to be cared for without it turning into something dark and painful." Samuel reached across the space between their chairs and offered his hand, palm up, letting her choose. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, then slowly placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers gently, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I cannot promise I will never hurt you," he said. "I am just a man, and men make mistakes, but I can promise I will never deliberately cause you pain. I can promise I will respect your choices, even when I do not agree with them. And I can promise that if you tell me to stop, I will stop. Always." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. She had not known it was possible for a man to speak to a woman this way, with such honesty and respect. "I am still married. Legally, I am still his wife. I know. And I am not asking for anything right now except the possibility that someday things might be different. That is all, just possibility." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat there as darkness fell completely, hands linked, and Sarah felt something inside her begin to heal. The next morning brought reality crashing back in the worst possible way. Sarah was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She stood, shading her eyes against the late morning sun, and felt her blood turn to ice. Calvin sat astride a beautiful black horse, flanked by 2 rough-looking men she recognized as associates of his from St. Louis. Her husband looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a cold, refined way, with dark hair slicked back and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of means. His face was set in an expression of righteous anger as he spotted her. "Sarah, get in the house." Samuel's voice came from behind her, calm but urgent. She had not heard him approach, but he was there now, positioning himself between her and the approaching riders. "That would be my wife you are addressing," Calvin called out, his voice dripping with false civility. "Sarah, darling, it is time to come home. I am willing to forgive this foolish escapade if you come with me now." Sarah could not move, could not breathe. She was trapped in a nightmare made real, her worst fear materialized on this sunny September morning. "She is not going anywhere," Samuel said, and his voice carried a note of authority that Sarah had never heard from him before. Calvin dismounted with theatrical grace, his men following suit. Up close, Sarah could see the cold fury in his eyes despite his pleasant expression. She knew that look. It meant someone would pay dearly for whatever had angered him. "This is not your concern, Cowboy. Sarah is my wife, legally bound to me before God and the law. She belongs with me." "She does not belong to anyone," Samuel said quietly. "She is a person, not property." Calvin's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the ugly rage beneath. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have friends, powerful friends. I can make your life very difficult. I imagine you can. But that does not change the fact that Sarah has the right to choose where she lives and who she lives with. She made her choice when she married me." Calvin's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she saw the promise of violence in his eyes. "Sarah, get your things. We are leaving. Now." Sarah found her voice, though it shook. "No." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Calvin's face flushed dark red. "What did you say to me?" I said no. "I am not going with you, Calvin. I am never going back." For a moment, Sarah thought he might lunge at her right there. But then one of his men shifted, and she realized with a chill that both men had their hands near their weapons. "You should leave," Samuel said, his voice still calm but his body tensed like a coiled spring. "Before this gets ugly." Calvin laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Before it gets ugly. Boy, you have no idea. I will destroy you. I will have the sheriff run you out of this pathetic town. I will make sure no one ever does business with you again. And then I will take what is mine because she is mine, whether she likes it or not. The only thing that is going to happen here is you are going to get back on your horses and ride out." The new voice came from the direction of the road, and Sarah turned to see 3 men approaching on horseback. She recognized one of them as Thomas Hayes, Margaret's husband. The other 2 wore tin stars on their vests. "Sheriff Williams," Calvin said, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "Thank goodness you are here. This man has been harboring my runaway wife. I simply want to take her home where she belongs." The sheriff, a weather-beaten man in his 50s with sharp eyes, looked from Calvin to Samuel to Sarah. "That true, miss? You this man's wife?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "And do you want to go with him?" "No." Her voice was stronger this time. "No, I do not." "You see," Calvin interjected smoothly, "she is not thinking clearly. She has been unduly influenced by this man. As her husband, I have the legal right to take her home." "Maybe so," the sheriff said slowly, "but I am not in the habit of forcing women to go places they do not want to go. Especially when they show up in my town with bruises they are trying to hide." Sarah's hand flew to her face instinctively, though the bruises Calvin had given her had long since faded. "I do not know what lies she has been telling you, but my wife is prone to hysteria and fabrication. She is unwell and needs proper care, which I can provide. The way you provided it before." Samuel's voice was soft but deadly. "By beating her until she was afraid for her life." Calvin's mask finally shattered completely. "You have no proof of anything, and you have no legal standing here whatsoever. Sheriff, I am asking you officially to help me retrieve my property." "She is not property," the sheriff said, his voice hardening. "And even if you do have a legal claim to take her back, which is questionable given the circumstances, it is not going to happen today. Now you and your friends need to mount up and ride out before I find a reason to lock you up for disturbing the peace." For a moment, Sarah thought Calvin would refuse. His hand moved toward his coat, and she knew he carried a pistol there. But then he seemed to calculate the odds, 3 lawmen plus Samuel and Thomas against him and his 2 hired guns, and he stepped back. "This is not over," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "You are my wife. You took vows before God, and I will not let you shame me by living in sin with some nobody cowboy. I will be back with the proper legal documents, and then there will be nothing anyone can do to keep you from me." He mounted his horse with deliberate dignity. and his men followed suit. As they rode away, Calvin looked back once, and the hatred in his eyes made Sarah's knees weak. When they were out of sight, she found herself sitting on the ground without remembering how she had gotten there. Samuel was beside her immediately, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Are you all right?" Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. Was she all right? Her husband had found her, had threatened the man who had given her sanctuary, had promised to return and force her back into a life of fear and pain. But Samuel's concerned face looking down at her, the sheriff and his deputy and Thomas all standing nearby with expressions of worry rather than judgment. She realized that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she felt. "I will be," she said, and found that despite everything, it was true. The sheriff helped her to her feet and introduced himself properly as John Williams. "Miss, I meant what I said out there. I do not know all your circumstances, but I have been doing this job long enough to recognize an abuser when I see one. That man has mean eyes." "He is dangerous," Sarah said. "He will not give up. He has money and influence, and he will find a way to take me back." Sheriff Williams exchanged a glance with Samuel. "Texas is a long way from St. Louis, and his influence does not reach as far down here as he thinks it does. That said, he is right about one thing. If you are legally married to him, he does have certain rights under the law, and there is only so much I can do to prevent him from exercising those rights." "Unless she was not married anymore," Thomas said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "I am just saying, Texas is getting more progressive about divorces. It is not easy and it is not quick, but if she could prove cruelty, it might be possible." "I could not afford a lawyer," Sarah said, her brief hope deflating. "Judge Miller owes me a favor," Sheriff Williams said thoughtfully. "A big one, and he has been known to take divorce cases pro bono when the situation warrants it. I could talk to him, feel out whether it is worth pursuing." Sarah looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "It is worth trying. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, we will figure it out." "I cannot ask you to do that. You are not asking. I am offering." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to upend his life for someone he had known less than 2 months. Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks, and for the first time, they were not tears of fear but of gratitude and something dangerously close to love. Over the next few weeks, Sarah met with Judge Raymond Miller, a grandfatherly man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. With Sheriff Williams' endorsement and her own testimony about the abuse she had suffered, the judge agreed to file for divorce on her behalf on the grounds of cruel treatment. The process would take at least 6 months, he warned, and there was no guarantee it would be granted. Calvin would be served with papers and given the opportunity to contest the divorce, which he almost certainly would. "But you have a strong case," Judge Miller assured her. "Texas courts have been moving toward recognizing a woman's right to leave an abusive marriage. It is not a guaranteed thing, but I believe we have a good chance." Sarah signed the papers with shaking hands and tried not to think about how Calvin would react when he received them. In the meantime, life at the ranch took on a different quality. The tentative connection between Sarah and Samuel deepened, though they were careful to maintain propriety. Samuel never pushed for more than she was ready to give, and Sarah found herself falling more in love with him every day for exactly that reason. They worked together in easy partnership now, her help with the horses freeing him to take on even more training work. Jack, the bay gelding who had been so fearful, had become one of their success stories. He now followed Sarah around like a puppy and had progressed to accepting a saddle and bridle, though they had not yet attempted to ride him. "He trusts you," Samuel said one evening as they watched Jack graze peacefully in his corral. "He knows you will not hurt him." I know what it is like to be afraid, Sarah said softly. To expect pain even from those who claim to care about you. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Do you still expect pain from me? Sarah considered the question carefully. No, not anymore. I think I finally understand that you are different. That not all men are like Calvin. Not all men, Samuel agreed. Though I wish there were fewer men like him in the world. As October arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the first hints that the brutal summer heat might eventually break, Calvin made his next move. Papers arrived from a high-priced lawyer in St. Louis, contesting the divorce and demanding that Sarah return to Missouri to face charges of abandonment of marriage and theft of property. She had apparently taken some of Calvin's money when she left, though Sarah could not imagine what he was referring to since she had left with nothing but the clothes on her back. Judge Miller reviewed the papers and snorted derisively. Intimidation tactics. He is trying to scare you into dropping the divorce and returning. Do not let it work. But it was working, at least partly. Sarah lay awake at night imagining scenarios where Calvin somehow won, where the law sided with him and she was forced to return, where Samuel was punished for helping her, where everything she had found here was stripped away. Samuel seemed to sense her growing anxiety, and one evening after dinner, he took her hand and led her out to the main corral where Jack was dozing in the last rays of sunlight. I want to tell you something, he said, and I need you to really hear it, all right? Sarah nodded, her heart beginning to pound. No matter what happens with the divorce, no matter what legal tricks your husband tries to pull, I am not giving up on you. If the law says you have to go back to him, we will fight it. If we have to leave Texas and go somewhere he cannot find us, we will do that. If we have to wait years for you to be free, I will wait. He turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. What I am trying to say, very badly, is that I love you, Sarah. I think I have loved you since that first day when you stood in my kitchen and told me you were a hard worker who would not be trouble. I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you are with the horses, patient and gentle even when they are difficult. I love the way you hum while you cook and the way you watch the sunset like it is the first one you have ever seen. I love you, and whatever comes, we will face it together. Sarah felt like her heart might burst. I love you too, she whispered. I've been so afraid to say it, afraid it would somehow make me weak or vulnerable. But I do. I love you, Samuel Caine, and you make me want to believe in happy endings again. Samuel smiled, that full, transformative smile that lit up his whole face. Can I kiss you? The fact that he asked, that he waited for her permission even now, made Sarah love him even more. Yes. He kissed her gently, as if she were something infinitely precious. It was nothing like the rough, possessive kisses Calvin had forced on her. This was tender and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was crying, but they were happy tears this time. We will get through this, Samuel said, brushing the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. I promise you we will find a way. Sarah believed him. The winter months passed slowly, marked by hearings and paperwork, and the grinding machinery of the legal system. Calvin appeared at one of the hearings in January, his lawyer arguing eloquently that Sarah was a confused woman who had been unduly influenced, and that her place was with her lawful husband. Sarah, with Judge Miller coaching her, told her story plainly and without embellishment. She showed the judge the scars she still carried, including one on her shoulder where Calvin had burned her with a cigar for contradicting him in front of his business associates. Calvin's lawyer tried to dismiss it as accidents or self-inflicted wounds, but Sarah could see doubt creeping into the judge's expression. When Calvin himself took the stand and spoke about Sarah with contempt thinly veiled as concern, calling her hysterical and mentally unbalanced. She saw the judge's face harden. It was March of 1879 when Judge Miller finally rendered his decision. Sarah stood in the courtroom with Samuel beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly, as the judge read from his papers. Having reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that the defendant, Calvin Reginald Monroe, has committed acts of cruelty and violence against the plaintiff sufficient to constitute grounds for divorce under Texas law. Furthermore, this court finds the plaintiff's testimony to be credible and the defendant's testimony to be, at best, unreliable. Therefore, this court grants the divorce petition. The marriage between Sarah Elizabeth Grace and Calvin Reginald Monroe is hereby dissolved. All claims of property or financial obligation between the parties are settled, with each party retaining whatever assets they currently possess. The defendant is ordered to have no further contact with the plaintiff and is barred from coming within 100 yards of her person or residence. This decision is final and not subject to appeal in this jurisdiction. Sarah felt her knees buckle, and Samuel's arm went around her waist, holding her up. It was over. She was free, truly, legally free. Calvin's face was apoplectic with rage, and his lawyer had to physically restrain him as he tried to approach Sarah. "You will regret this," he shouted as the bailiff moved to escort him from the courtroom. "You are nothing without me. You will come crawling back, and when you do, I will make you suffer for this humiliation." "Get him out of here," Judge Miller said wearily. "And if he violates that no-contact order, he will spend the next 6 months in jail." Outside the courthouse, Sarah collapsed into Samuel's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion and joy. "It is over. I am free." "You are free," Samuel agreed, holding her close. "And now we can finally start our life together, if that is what you want." Sarah pulled back to look at him, this man who had saved her in every way that mattered. "That is exactly what I want, more than anything." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Brownsville, with Margaret and Thomas Hayes as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Sarah wore a new dress that Margaret had helped her make, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Samuel wore his best suit, which he confessed he had not worn since leaving Virginia years ago. And he looked so handsome that Sarah felt her breath catch when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Peters who had been serving Brownsville since before it was officially a town, kept the ceremony short and sweet. When he pronounced them man and wife and Samuel kissed her, Sarah felt something inside her finally, completely heal. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Partnership and respect and love freely given and received. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by what seemed like every woman in Brownsville. There was dancing and laughter and genuine happiness, and Sarah felt welcomed into a community in a way she had never experienced before. As evening approached and she and Samuel prepared to return to the ranch, their ranch now, Margaret pulled her aside. "I knew from the moment I met you that you were special," Margaret said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "And I knew Samuel was the right man for you. You have both been through so much, but you found each other, and that is something precious. Do not ever take it for granted." "I will not," Sarah promised. "He saved my life, Margaret, in every possible way." "And you saved his," Margaret said. "He was just existing before you came. Now he is truly living. That is what love does." Back at the ranch, Samuel carried Sarah over the threshold despite her laughing protests that it was unnecessary. He set her down gently in the main room, and they stood there looking at each other in the lamplight, suddenly shy despite everything they had been through together. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Sarah said honestly. "You have given me everything I thought I had lost forever: safety, respect, love, a home, a future." "You gave me those things too," Samuel said. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were here. How much I was just going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. You changed everything for me, Sarah." She kissed him then, deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally made their way to their bedroom, now truly their shared space, Samuel was infinitely gentle and patient, letting Sarah set the pace, stopping whenever she showed any sign of nervousness or discomfort. It was everything her wedding night with Calvin had not been: tender and loving and mutual. Afterward, lying in Samuel's arms in the darkness, Sarah felt a peace she had not known was possible. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being you. For showing me that love does not have to hurt." Samuel pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me try." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Sarah's life. Spring brought wildflowers to the Texas plains and new foals to some of their horses. The ranch was thriving, with Samuel's reputation as a horse trainer bringing in more business than he could handle alone. Sarah proved to have a natural talent for working with the animals, particularly the ones that were fearful or difficult, and they began training horses together as true partners. In June, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Samuel over breakfast one morning, and his face lit up with such pure joy that she found herself crying happy tears. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she could see the answer on his face. Happy does not even begin to cover it. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed, but mostly just grateful. For you, for this, for everything we have built together. The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and the summer heat made her miserable. But Samuel was attentive and patient, taking over more of the heavy work and making sure she rested when she needed to. Margaret visited often, bringing advice and supplies and the kind of practical support that Sarah desperately needed. In February of 1880, nearly 2 years after she had first arrived in Brownsville, Sarah gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the town's midwife, Mrs. Chen and Margaret, with Samuel pacing anxiously in the main room. When Mrs. Chen finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy baby boy and his wife was doing well, Samuel collapsed into a chair with relief. They named him James Thomas Caine, after Samuel's father and Thomas Hayes, who had become like family to them. Jamie, as they immediately began calling him, had Samuel's dark hair and Sarah's green eyes, and from the moment Sarah held him, she felt a fierce, protective love that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "He is perfect," Samuel said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and looking at his son with wonder. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you did this." "We did this," Sarah corrected. "Together." Watching Samuel with Jamie over the following weeks and months, Sarah fell in love with him all over again. He was a natural father, patient and gentle and completely devoted. He would wake up for nighttime feedings even though Sarah was nursing, just to keep her company. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving horses into the wood. He sang lullabies in a surprisingly good voice and could calm Jamie's crying faster than anyone. As Jamie grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They added on to the house, building 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. They hired a young man named Miguel to help with the horses, giving Samuel more time to spend with his family. They became pillars of the Brownsville community, attending church socials and helping neighbors, and generally building a life that was everything Sarah had dreamed of, but never thought she could have. When Jamie was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, though she tired more quickly chasing after an energetic toddler. In the spring of 1883, she gave birth to a daughter they named Emily Rose, with Margaret's gray eyes and Samuel's smile. Jamie was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and bringing her toys and talking to her constantly, even though she was far too young to understand. Life settled into a rhythm of joyful chaos, filled with children's laughter and honest work, and the kind of bone-deep contentment that comes from living authentically and being truly loved. Sarah would sometimes catch herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to shatter this happiness. But as years passed and nothing bad happened, she gradually learned to trust that this was real, that she deserved this happiness, that the darkness of her past did not have to define her future. There were challenges, of course. A hard winter in 1884 that killed several of their horses and nearly bankrupted them. A bout of scarlet fever that swept through Brownsville and had them terrified for Jamie and Emily, though both children recovered fully. The normal struggles of running a ranch and raising a family, and maintaining a marriage through the daily grind of ordinary life. But through it all, Sarah and Samuel faced everything as partners. They argued sometimes, usually over small things like how much to spend on new equipment or whether Jamie was old enough for his own horse. But Samuel never raised his voice, never let disagreements turn into cruelty, and always listened when Sarah spoke. He honored her opinions and respected her choices, and he showed their children by example what a healthy relationship looked like. In the summer of 1887, when Jamie was 7 and Emily was 4, Margaret came to visit with surprising news. "You remember that horrible husband of yours?" Sarah stiffened at the mention of Calvin. She had not thought about him in years, had deliberately not asked about him or wondered what had become of him. "Yes. Why? He died. Last month, apparently, some kind of heart ailment. His lawyer sent notice to Judge Miller in case there were any legal complications, but since the divorce was final years ago, there are not. I just thought you should know." Sarah sat down heavily, trying to process this information. Calvin was dead. The man who had terrorized her, who had haunted her nightmares for years after she left him, was simply gone. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked gently. "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "Relieved, I think, and a little sad, which is strange. Not sad for him exactly, but sad that he never learned to be better, that he wasted his whole life being cruel and angry." That evening, she told Samuel about Calvin's death. He held her while she cried, tears for the girl she had been who had married a monster, tears of relief that the threat was truly gone, tears of gratitude for the life she had now. "You ever regret it?" she asked Samuel later, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the pastures. "Taking in a desperate woman with nothing, turning your whole life upside down for me." Samuel looked at her with such love that it took her breath away, even after all these years. "Not for a single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah. You and our children and this life we have built. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Sarah leaned into him, watching their children play in the yard, Jamie showing Emily how to throw a rope like a real cowboy while she giggled and missed repeatedly. This was what she had been seeking when she fled St. Louis in terror. Not just safety, though Samuel had given her that, but belonging, purpose, love in its purest form. She had come to Texas broken and afraid, seeking only to survive, and she had found so much more. She had found a partner who saw her as an equal. She had found a community that embraced her. She had found work that fulfilled her and children who delighted her, and a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. But most of all, she had found Samuel, the cowboy who had given her love beyond her wildest dreams. As the years continued to unfold, the Caine family grew and flourished. Jamie proved to have his father's way with horses and his mother's gentle touch with the frightened ones. By the time he was 12, he was already helping train some of the younger horses, and Samuel beamed with pride watching his son work. Emily was more interested in the business side of things, learning to keep the ranch books and handle correspondence with clients. She was sharp as a tack and could calculate figures in her head faster than Samuel could do them on paper. "She's going to run this whole operation someday," Samuel joked, but there was truth in it. In 1891, Sarah gave birth to their third and final child, another boy they named Robert Samuel, called Bobby from the start. He was a surprise baby, arriving when Sarah was 34 and had thought her childbearing years were behind her. But he was a joyful surprise, good-natured and easygoing where Jamie had been serious and Emily had been demanding. The ranch had grown significantly over the years. They now had over 60 horses at any given time, including several breeding mares that produced foals they trained from birth. They employed 4 full-time hands and several part-time workers during busy seasons. The original small house had been expanded twice and now sprawled comfortably across the property, with enough room for everyone and still space left over for the occasional guest. Samuel had gained a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in Texas, and people came from as far as San Antonio and Houston to buy horses from him. Sarah's role in the business was well known too, and several wealthy clients specifically requested that she work with their horses, particularly the difficult ones. Life was good, better than good. It was full and rich and meaningful in ways Sarah could never have imagined that day. She stumbled off the stagecoach in Brownsville, desperate and afraid. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Sarah on a trip to San Antonio, leaving the children with Margaret and Thomas. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch and the children for more than a day, and Sarah felt oddly unmoored without them. But Samuel had planned everything carefully, booking them a room in a nice hotel, and taking her to dinner at a restaurant with tablecloths and multiple forks and food she could not pronounce. After dinner, they walked along the river in the warm spring evening, and Samuel pulled her to a stop beneath a cottonwood tree. "I want to tell you something," he said, and Sarah smiled because it was almost exactly what he had said that night in the corral when he first told her he loved her. "I am listening. When I married you, I thought I understood what love was. I thought I loved you as much as it was possible to love another person, but I was wrong. Every single day, I find myself loving you more than the day before. Watching you with our children, seeing you work with the horses, sitting with you on the porch in the evenings, all of it just makes me love you more deeply. So I wanted to tell you, on our 10th anniversary, that the best decision I ever made was opening my home to a scared woman who needed help. And the second best decision was asking that woman to be my wife." Sarah was crying again, but they were happy tears. "You have given me everything, Samuel. A home, a family, a purpose. But more than that, you have given me myself. You let me become who I was meant to be instead of trying to shape me into something else. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They kissed beneath the cottonwood tree while the river flowed by and the stars came out overhead, and Sarah thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl who fled her abuser. She had found her strength, her voice, and her place in the world. And she had found love, real love, the kind that built you up instead of tearing you down. The years continued to pass, marked by the small joys and occasional sorrows that make up a life well lived. Jamie married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread when he was 22, and they built a house on the far end of the Caine property, close enough to work the ranch together, but far enough for privacy. They had 3 children in quick succession, making Sarah a grandmother before she turned 45. Emily showed no interest in marriage, much to the despair of several local young men. Instead, she took over more and more of the business operations, eventually becoming the ranch's official manager when Samuel decided to step back and focus more on training. She proved to be brilliant at it, negotiating contracts and managing finances with a skill that increased their profits significantly. Bobby, the baby of the family, surprised everyone by showing an interest in medicine. When he was 16, he apprenticed with Doc Walker in town, and eventually went to medical school in Galveston, returning to Brownsville to set up his own practice. He never worked the ranch the way his siblings did, but he was there for family dinners every Sunday and doctored the family and ranch hands for free, so no one complained about his different path. Margaret and Thomas remained close friends through the years, aging gracefully and remaining active in the community until Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. Margaret lived another 5 years, finally succumbing to pneumonia at 76. Sarah mourned them both deeply, remembering always that it was Margaret who had brought her to Samuel that first day. Margaret who had seen something in a desperate stranger and chose to help. Samuel's hair turned silver at the temples in his 50s, and Sarah developed laugh lines around her eyes from years of smiling. They moved a bit slower, tired more easily, but the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something solid and unshakable, the foundation upon which their entire family was built. On a warm evening in the spring of 1905, Sarah and Samuel sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown and their grandchildren running wild in the yard below. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Samuel asked, reaching over to take her hand. "Of course. You told me you cared for me and I was terrified. And now," Sarah smiled, "now I cannot imagine my life any other way. You know, when I left St. Louis, I thought I was running away. But really, I was running toward this, toward you, toward the life we have built together." "I am glad you ran in the right direction," Samuel said with a smile, "though I like to think I would have found you eventually, even if you had gone somewhere else. You think we were meant to be." "I know we were." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared. In the distance, they could hear Jamie calling his children in for supper, and Emily's voice raised in laughter at something one of the ranch hands said. Bobby's buggy was coming up the drive for Sunday dinner a day early, probably bringing news about someone in town who needed tending. This was their legacy, Sarah thought. Not just the successful ranch or the children they had raised or the grandchildren who carried their names. But this, the love they had built from nothing, the family they had created, the life they had forged together against all odds. She had come to Texas seeking only safety, expecting nothing more than a place to hide from the man who wanted to destroy her. And she had found Samuel Caine, a cowboy who had given her not just safety but love beyond her wildest dreams, love that had healed her wounds and given her strength, love that had created a family and built a legacy, love that would endure long after they were both gone, passed down through generations of children who would grow up knowing that love was meant to be gentle and kind and true. "I love you," she said to Samuel, the words as true now as the first time she had spoken them. "I love you too," he replied, squeezing her hand. "Always have, always will." And as the stars came out one by one over the Texas plains, Sarah Grace Caine smiled, content in the knowledge that she was home, truly and finally home, in the arms of the man who had saved her and in the life they had built together. The darkness of her past had given way to the light of a future filled with love, and that was more than she had ever dared to dream of when she stumbled off that stagecoach 27 years ago, desperate and afraid and hoping only to survive. She had done so much more than survive. She had lived fully and completely, and she had loved and been loved in return. And that, Sarah thought as Samuel raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, that was everything.